Former Immigration Minister Philip Ruddock is now the government's special envoy for citizenship and community engagement. Last November, he visited refugee camps in Jordan, Lebanon and Turkey, along with Chief Opposition Whip Chris Hayes. They both joined me from Canberra a short time ago. Gentlemen, welcome to Lateline.
Thank you very much.
You've both been to these refugee camps in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Turkey. Philip Ruddock, what's your enduring memory of those places?
Well, I'd been earlier. I'd been with Save the Children to the Zatri camp in Jordan, right on the Syrian border. And I can remember meeting with a young girl who was explaining to me that she was there for a short time and she expected to be able to go home, and she was about 15 and resume her studies and was contemplating what she might be able to do later. When I went back with Chris, I was despondent because here were the same young people looking at a situation that had gone on another 12 months, and if we're looking at now, another 12 months further with no prospect of resolution, no future. And when you're seeing young people like this, who are going to be so marginalised, so dispossessed, you can't help but grieve for what is going on.
Chris Hayes, you've said before that you can't leave a place like that unaffected. What affected you most?
Well, I suppose when we're over there, Emma, apart from the despair, the hopelessness of their situation, but the lack of belief in the future, just about everyone that Philip and I met in the refugee camps, they wanted one thing: they wanted to go home. And bear in mind, when this conflict started back in 2011, the estimations for the international community, this was a conflict that would probably go on for 3 months. Matter of fact, the UN constructed their camps to reflect a 3-month duration. 4 years down the track, there is no end in sight to this. The despair is just palpable. And these young people, as Philip just spoke about, they come from, when they came from Syria, which had a reasonably well-established education system, only the lucky kids are sitting in refugee camps in a tent, sitting on the floor, being able to study. The vast majority of kids, unfortunately, are not or no longer in formal education, and regrettably they're going to be cannon fodder for tomorrow's jihadists.
Philip Ruddock, for the better part of a year or more, you've been telling your government this is the worst humanitarian crisis possibly in living memory. In March, you called specifically for Australia to do more. Why has the Prime Minister not decided to act until now?
Well, I don't think you can just blame the Prime Minister. I mean, you have to ask the international community where it's been. When you look at what is occurring, yes, there have been contributions, yes, there have been resettlement programs. Australia is taking people from Syria and also from Iraq, and it runs to modest numbers in the several thousands, and we've been doing that for some time. But when you are faced with the size and the dimension of the problem. When we were there, we were looking at 7.5 million people displaced internally. Nobody could give you accurate figures as to the numbers of people in Lebanon, but we were looking at something like a country with 4 million people, with 1.5 million people as refugees. Similarly in Jordan, 7 million people, 1.5 million people as refugees. In Turkey, a much larger population, and again, looking at somewhere of the order of 1.5 to 2 million refugees. Now, this problem has gone on. What we're seeing and what's focused people's attention is that so many people now have said, well, we've had enough. My problem is that I can't find the effective international leadership that we need when I engage with other countries to talk about the way forward.
But let's stick specifically to the current humanitarian crisis at hand. Chris Hayes, the Prime Minister, doesn't want to lift the overall humanitarian intake, so he's instead proposing that we take more Syrian refugees, but at the expense of other people seeking protection from Australia. What do you think of that response?
Well, as you saw this morning, Emma, Bill Shorten announced that we wanted to engage in discussion with the government to hopefully arrive at a bipartisan position of taking an additional 10,000 people, one-off, in addition to the 13,750, but taking the 10,000 from Syria. I know in light of all the numbers of people seeking refuge, that is still probably a small number, but that's something I think that falls within Australia's responsibilities to this region. We do have ongoing responsibilities there, and clearly I think this is one of the things that we should be showing some leadership in.
Philip Ruddock, under the Prime Minister's plan, we're going to have to take fewer Iraqis, Afghanis, Rohingya Muslims from fleeing persecution in Myanmar. In fact, this is a group the United Nations considers the most persecuted minority in the world. Do you accept that that's the best Australia can do?
No, I take the view that the Prime Minister, in his response, noted the urgency of the situation, noted the numbers, which I've spoken of, and indicated that the Minister has been sent to Geneva to consult on the best way that Australia will be able to help in relation to this matter. And I think he indicated that he was open to continue to talk to the opposition in the light of these matters when he has the further information that the Minister will provide to him. And look, I mean, there is a degree of political...
Pardon me for the interruption, but do you think, Philip Ruddock, that we should be increasing the overall numbers we're taking, given the scope of this crisis?
I think the sorts of numbers that we could additionally take is a mere drop in the ocean in relation to the size and the enormity of the problem.
But it all helps, I suppose.
I go back to the point I made in the beginning. We can talk about the numbers of people that might be able to be taken, and it will have a marginal impact on a problem of enormous dimension. I think the focus needs to be on how we can work with the international community to resolve this situation so people can in fact go home. And that's where I am putting my priority at the moment. It was one of the reasons that when I went as a member of the Intelligence and Security Committee to talk about issues relating to citizenship deprivation and like matters, I raised with other governments, with the State Department in the United States, how can we resolve this issue, which will inevitably leave us with a far greater problem if we don't deal with it now.
Chris Hayes, German Economy Minister Sigmar Gabriel tonight says his country is economically strong and financially prosperous, so it can afford to do more. Doesn't the same apply to Australia, given we're one of only a few Western countries that escaped the global financial crisis without falling into recession? We are one of the strongest, economically speaking, countries in the world?
I think the analogy is fine. But there's also an added responsibility, a moral responsibility that falls on countries such as Australia. Don't forget, Emma, that we were part of the coalition of willing in 2003. We were involved in an engagement which left a power vacuum, and that vacuum's been filled by extremist forces such as ISIL. To that extent, we do have some ongoing and residual responsibilities here, not just through our economic strength, but something that we need to, I suppose, acquit ourselves of that responsibility and showing global leadership. Bear in mind, Emma, this is the worst humanitarian crisis since the Second World War. It does require an international coordinated response, and I think we have a significant part to play in that.
And just finally, a comment from each of you, if I could. Australia is likely to submit to a request to join airstrikes in Syria. How is that going to help the people of that country, the people we've been talking about tonight, especially given the invariable civilian casualties and the subsequent increased refugee flows? Philip Ruddock.
Well, I notice that Russia is putting airplanes into Syria at the moment with the stated objective of also bombing ISIS. And I must say, as far as I can see, bombing may have a marginal impact, but the resolution of this issue is going to need a lot more, and it needs to be a determination to bring all of the countries with different interests together to ensure it's resolved. I mean, the size and dimension of the problem goes well beyond Europe being able to accommodate a relatively small number of refugees. Australia doing the same. We will play our part, but an outcome in which you actually address the underlying causes is what is needed. It has to be addressed by the countries of the world determined to ensure it is resolved, and I've outlined how I think that should happen.
Chris Hayes.
Well, I actually agree with Philip's synopsis there. I think In terms of the airstrikes in Iraq, they have taken place on a bipartisan position in terms of our engagement. I'm confident we will work to achieve a bipartisan approach in terms of Syria. But airstrikes are one thing, but bear in mind, at present there are multiple actors in Syria, not just ISIS, not just the Free Syrian Army, but also the regime itself. And therefore it does take an international and coordinated response to this, one to be able to give a humanitarian outcome for all.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you very much for your time this evening.
Thank you very much, Emma.